Rick, hello. Thank you for joining us today.
Nice to be here.
Thank you, Rick. Rick, I appreciate your time. As I was telling you offline, out of all the guests I've had, I think you've been the most organized. So it's really appreciated, but it also kind of, I wanted to make sure that I am similarly organized, which I'm not always. So, and I was saying to you, I think that must be to you to do with your background being from like a scientific background. Um,
hmm
can you tell us a little bit about what you're doing currently?
Well, right now I'm a retired electronics engineer, but mostly I'm organizing local activities around international issues. And as much as I can, I like to write articles. The articles are published in various publications such as LA Progressive, antiwar.com, Dissident Voice, and so forth. I follow events in the Middle East closely, and the big international issues as well. I'm very concerned about. I just came back from China a week ago, and I previously visited in spring of 2023. I was in Russia, including Crimea. So I like to travel and observe things firsthand as much as possible, and do whatever I can to educate my community here about the real things going on in the world, and that the United States is not the center of the world.
Rick, this is why I found it so interesting. How did you get from a scientific engineering background? How were you always interested in geopolitics? Because it kind of reminds me a little bit about myself as well. I kind of studied computer science, and then I did international relations, and then I studied law. So I'm all over the place a little bit. So how did you go from engineering to interest in geopolitics?
Well, I went the other way around, actually. I got interested in international politics when I was a young man. I hitchhiked around the United States because I grew up in Canada, and traveled around the United States and Mexico, Central America. I was in Nicaragua when it was under the Somoza dictatorship, and I had my eyes opened as a young man. And my eyes opened about the United States as well, because at that time in 1969, there were still vestiges of overt racism in the south of the United States. So change was in the air. It was the late 1960s, and I became a political activist. I went to university and I studied Marxism and other ideologies, and learned about the world, and then was an activist for about 10 years, primarily working in support of the liberation movements in Southern Africa, Angola, Mozambique, South Africa. And it was before Nelson Mandela was a household name. In fact, he was a prisoner in Robben Island. But we did a lot of good work. We had a small publishing house that published life histories from the revolution, which really stand the test of time. And and then it was later on, after I had a young family and I needed to get a job, and I went into I started studying electronics at that time, and then had a 25-year career mostly at the University of California at Berkeley. And then when I could, I retired and returned really to the political activism that's of most interest to me.
That's so great. And yeah, because of your varied background, I actually had a lot of different geographically um, a list of different things, places that I wanted your opinion on, including what's going on in Ukraine and what's going on in the Middle East. But to start with, today's Friday, and earlier on this week, we had the US elections with Trump winning pretty comfortably. How do you see that? And how, from a geopolitical point of view, from Ukraine and what's happening in the Middle East, how do you see um, that impacting geopolitics?
hmm Well, one thing about the US is that no matter who wins, it seems like the foreign policy doesn't change substantially. There are big differences between Republicans and Democrats on some social issues, but the war machine and the empire continues nonetheless. So Trump, of course, occasionally says he's for peace. He wants to end wars. He's not going to start wars, but time will tell. I think we're going to see some clear indications of where he's heading as it becomes clear who's going to be his defense secretary, secretary of state. If people like Mike Pompeo are prominent in this administration, that's going to be a very bad sign.
Yes, I heard the name Pompeo floating about. Do you think there's something behind? Like, is that actual news or is that like just rumor mill?
It's not confirmed yet that I know of, but it was just the day before the election that Trump did a big salute to Mike Pompeo in the audience and put him forward and said how great he was looking. And Pompeo, of course, was CIA director and then Secretary of State under Trump's first administration. So that's going to be a very bad sign, because this is the man who, as the CIA director, was plotting to assassinate Julian Assange, who guided the attacks on Iran, the assassination in Baghdad, actually.
Qasem Soleimani.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So this is going to be a very negative sign if Pompeo is appointed.
It is worrying, and it's also telling, because Trump talked a lot about how he didn't have a good team before, and now he's learned and he's going to come up with better people. And if this is where we're starting from, then it's not a great sign.
Right. I mean, I think maybe he's learned. Of course, he came into politics having no political experience. He was an owner of a hotel chain and a big real estate mogul, but it's not like he had a lot of big organizational, let alone government experience. So he didn't seem to know how to put the people in charge who would carry out his policies. And so in many respects, he was surrounded by people who seemed to be undermining his policy. For example, when he tried to withdraw U.S. forces from Syria, yes. The people in his administration just ignored him. And so has he learned from that? I don't know. I think one thing he may have learned is that you don't want to make an enemy of the CIA and the intelligence community. And of course, so he may be recognizing that a policy that foreign policy that goes against U.S. imperial interests is going to get him in trouble. Criticizing NATO and talking about what use is NATO these days, that's a recipe for making some very big enemies. And he may now realize that that he doesn't want to go there, even though those are some of the things that have won him votes. The fact that he was questioning the military complex, questioning the U.S. constant wars abroad. Those are the things that won him some votes. But is he going to carry it out? That's the big question now.
Yeah, for me, that's one of the big tests. I'm waiting to see whether he's going to continue his stance on NATO and how it's useless and the USA should come out of it, or is he going to completely do a U-turn on that? I think that might be another indicator of things to come. How also do you see, because Trump's made a lot of, as you say, in the past, he's been talking about how he's not interested in starting wars, and wars are a big burden on US economy. And he's also been talking about how he's going to stop the war in Ukraine, apparently with a telephone call. But regardless of how he does it, how practical do you think that is? Because the situation on the ground is such that Russia is in a very kind of a dominating position, if not, can't call it comfortable, but dominating position, and they wouldn't want to just give away all their advantages for the sake of Trump. And then, so they're going to want to push some of their own agendas. And how is Trump going to take that? Because stopping the war in a humiliating way might not be a solution for the US as well.
Hmm. Right. It may be that Trump wants things to be determined before he comes into office, so that he can lay the blame on Biden and the Biden administration. If Ukraine continues to deteriorate, if the Russians continue their advance over the next several months into the Trump after Trump's inaugurated, then it's going to be a real question whether he is going to recognize reality, that this was a failed project from the get-go, that it was a misguided idea, or whether he's going to do something to escalate. Some analysts believe that he's not going to end the project, but he's going to try to sustain it. Of course, for all of his criticism of NATO that he made at a couple of points, he was mostly criticizing the European countries for not
Contributing enough.
arming enough, not fulfilling their so-called obligation to provide several percent of their GDP in weapons and armaments. Of course, mostly, or many of which they were having to purchase from the U.S. So it was an economic. There was an economic factor and an economic boost to the United States, and of course, the same thing is now with Ukraine. For all the tens of billions of dollars that the U.S. is giving, this is weaponry that's being manufactured in the U.S., and it's helpful for the U.S. Military economy.
Yeah, and how do you see leading up to when Trump takes office? That's in January, is it? And how do you see the Biden administration? Are they going to? It might be that they double down in the support of Ukraine to get like a temporary surge, so that when Trump does take over, if things go south, then again, like you said, then they can blame Trump.
Exactly. I think that's exactly what they want to do, is to hold out. They'll be pouring. I mean, just in the last day, it's been announced that the U.S. is expediting the shipment of weapons to Ukraine. They desperately want to stave off the collapse of the Ukrainian army until after Trump is inaugurated, so that they don't get tarred with the failure. In some ways, it's comparable to what happened in Afghanistan, in that it was after the Biden administration took office, and so they were the collapse in Afghanistan took place under the Biden's administration, and I'm sure the Democrats would like a collapse of Ukraine to take place when Trump is president.
Yeah. Also, looking at all of these things, I was just thinking even earlier today, when we look at the whole chessboard, the political chessboard in international relations, it's not just what's happening is immoral on so many levels, but it's just completely insane. I can't see any rhyme or reason behind any of it, starting from why did Ukraine allow itself to be in a situation where it was pushed into a war seemingly by the West, even though even in March 2022, they were ready to do a deal, which was kind of stopped by Boris Johnson in the UK and Victoria Nolan. And Ukraine could have been in a very comfortable situation, being a neutral state between Europe and Russia, a buffer zone, taking advantage of both countries. Completely makes no sense what happened there. And then also how Europe allowed itself to be driven by US ambitions to the point where their economies are in tatters now. And if the US pulls out, Europe is in no position to keep supporting Ukraine after that. So how embarrassing, apart from anything, will that be? And then we've got like the soldiers in Ukraine who are fighting like a losing battle heroically, but it's it, it's a losing battle for so many reasons. And then how Biden has allowed Israel to basically dictate, um, in some ways. I mean, what's happened to Biden um, to Democrats can't all be blamed on what's happening in the Middle East, but it's a big factor. So all of these things, it makes no sense. It's kind of to the detriment of the individual players. I don't understand what any of them have got out of it.
Right. I totally agree with you. Especially regarding Ukraine, how the events that have unfolded there are so much against the interests of the vast majority of Ukrainian people. It really beggars the imagination to know what they were thinking and how they're continuing. I think what played a significant role was politicization, brainwashing, and straight out corruption. And of course, when Zelensky was initially elected, he was a peace candidate who was coming
Yeah.
from Eastern Ukraine, and he spoke Russian, and he was voted into power with an understanding that he would resolve the conflict with the Donbass. And of course, he did a 180 reversal on that, and then of course has become the loyal implementer of U.S., U.K., and European policy there, continuing the war. It's been an unmitigated disaster. Of course, people like John Mearsheimer, the American political scientist, predicted exactly what has happened 10 years ago. He said,
Yeah.
if the United States insists on making Ukraine a tool of NATO, Russia will intervene and will break up and destroy Ukraine rather than to allow that. And of course, that's exactly what has happened. It's tragic on so many levels, and I think you're exactly right that in the future people are going to look back at this and just shake their heads at in some ways, how could people have been brainwashed so badly to carry out this policy, and also at the amorality of the United States and the West, which has driven this policy and which has done this. So it's tragic on so many levels.
Also, I completely don't understand the role of Germany in all of this, and why did they allow themselves to be used like this to the point where the
Mm-hmm.
Nord Stream pipeline was destroyed, and they can't even talk about that in public because it's clear what happened there, even though initially they wanted to push the line that maybe the Russians did it, or maybe the Ukrainians did it, or someone in a boat came and did it, 3 people. So there was all sorts of kind of misinformation being spread out just because they were so embarrassed to face what's actually happened.
Mm-hmm.
But how they've allowed the economy, which was completely dependent on cheap Russian oil, and
Right.
even if the war stops now, I don't see how that can be revived.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
how do you see that? So if the war was to end, do you see that like the relationships between Russia and Germany could recover anytime soon? And even if they did, presumably Russia's now got customers for the oil that was previously being shipped to Germany. Would Russia want to divert that back into Germany, or is Russia comfortable with the situation the way it is, providing oil to India and then India selling it to Europe at a
Yeah.
much more expensive rate. How do you see, like, if the war was to end at some point in the near future, how do you see the relationship between Europe and Russia?
Hmm. Well, I think it's, the hatred has always been one way. It's the West hating Russia, never Russia hating the West. So I think if and when Germany does come to its senses and realize that being friendly with Russia, having positive economic relations with Russia is in their interest, when they eventually recognize that, I don't think Russia is going to reject it. Um, it's like when I was in Crimea, I was struck by the fact that the people there don't hate Ukrainians, and it's the rejection of Russian culture, the rejection of all things Russia, the Russian language, the Russian artists, Russian musicians and cultural workers. The hatred has always been one way, and the West has been driving that for their own reasons. I think that what I think the conflict in Ukraine was intentionally provoked by the West with the goal, the very clear goal of weakening Russia. Of course, the United States officials expressed that explicitly, but I think the goal, like Hillary Clinton, just a couple of days after Russia went into Ukraine in February of 2022, she said Afghanistan is the model. And what she meant by that was the United States in beginning in the late 1970s and through the 80s, the U.S. promoted the insurgency and the jihad in Afghanistan to overthrow the Afghanistan government. They initially had a progressive government in 1978-79, and they asked for Russian support. Russia sent troops, and that played a role in the collapse of the Soviet Union. And I think the West was looking at that and wanting to do a repeat of it. This big dude Brzezinski is his, he wrote a famous book called The Grand Chessboard, talking about Eurasia and how essential it was to global domination, and how Russia needed to be broken up. And he even went so far as to say, what parts it should be divided into. So I think there was a goal on the part of Western elites to break up Russia, and the Ukraine. What unfolded there was a vital part of it, and they haven't yet realized that their project is failing.
I think you're right, and I think if when Hillary ran for president in the US, if she had won, the war in Ukraine would have started like 8 years earlier because she was so desperate to start a war with Russia.
Yeah, right.
Um, Also, how do you see um, the situation as what's happening in the Middle East right now between Israel and Iran and Lebanon and those countries?
Yeah. Well, Israel, I think, is in a prolonged state of collapse. Militarily, there are signs that it is weakening. The number of soldiers who are refusing to return to fight is increasing. The reports of suicides among soldiers with PTSD, and the war just goes on. The country is obviously fracturing along many different themes: religious, political, economic. There's a significant emigration. People are leaving the country. So I think it's a prolonged, it's going to be a prolonged collapse of the Zionist project there. Of course, Israel's been sustained for since its beginning by avid support from the West, and they had a certain amount of credibility, but that credibility is completely breaking apart. Um, and even in the West now, there's more and more explicit questioning and opposition to Israel. For example, the Los Angeles Times, which is one of the major newspapers in the United States, refused to endorse Trump or Harris for president, and one of their reasons was both candidates are supporting the genocide in Gaza. Um, so even at elite levels, at the base level, more and more uh, people in the United States recognize that the mythology of Israel as this as something positive is completely erroneous, and that it is a racist regime with a lot of characteristics of a fascist government as well, including a belief in ethnic supremacy, a reliance on militarism, and a reliance on violence that they just don't even question. They, in fact, of course, all the videos of the soldiers blowing up buildings and committing all sorts of atrocities with smiles on their faces.
Yeah, and I can't believe how they're openly talking about how the Palestinians are Amalek and they're animals and they're not human. And
Hmm.
the West is just turning a blind eye ear to
Yeah.
all of this. And with all of their lectures to countries like China and other countries about human rights, how can they just sit there and um, absorb all of that and then continue their support? Is
Hmm.
embarrassing. And these people, future generations, as you say, will look back at disgust in disgust.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
How do you see within Israel society? Do you see any rifts building up? Because yes, there's talks about how even before the war started, there was great split between the religious factions and the seculars. There was even the president of Israel predicted that if this continues, there could be civil war within Israel.
Mhm.
However, since the war started, it seems like everyone is fine for the war to continue. There doesn't seem to be any resistance to the war. Do you see anything like changing there, or is it more of the same?
I think I'm. It's been very disappointing to learn that there is 80 or 90% support for the war effort. Things have evolved in a very bad way over the last 15 years. There used to be a more significant peace movement in Israel, but I think it's going to, the lines of fracture are there. For example, there's more and more resentment of the religious people who are not required to go into the military. So more soldiers are questioning that. I think the collapse of Israel's standing in the world is dragging down the U.S. as well. It's
Yeah,
impacting the United States and Western countries as well. And at some point, the West is going to realize that Israel is a sinking ship, and why are they continuing to support it as they do? Um, so I think that things are going to change. Whether are they going to change in a year or two, or is it going to take 5 or 10 years? I don't know. But the trend is very very strong that the genocide in Gaza, with the damage that it has done to Israel's reputation and political standing, is huge, and it's impacting the international standing of the entire West. For example, more and more countries are saying that Israel needs to be suspended from the United Nations. Just the other day, Malaysia proposed this. And it's interesting. I looked at how Israel was initiated into the United Nations in 1948, and it was a split vote. They managed to win the enough votes to be admitted to the United Nations, but there was an explicit promise and a statement that Israel was to be a peace-loving state. Those were the exact words. And the Israeli representative committed to being a peace-loving state. And of course, nothing could be further from the truth. Ever since its beginning, Israel has been creating war after war after war, launching the surprise attack in 1967, and the invasion of Lebanon in 82, up until today. It's far from being a peace-loving state. It's obviously a warmongering state, and it does needs to be expelled from the United Nations, and a massive international campaign developed to make it a pariah state and isolate it, just as South African apartheid was the subject of a massive international campaign in the 1980s.
Let me just take a moment's break to introduce our sponsors for today. This episode is proudly being sponsored by the Worldwide Listings Company Limited, or WLC for short. WLC is a e-commerce marketing agency specializing in making brands successful on Amazon. So if you are thinking of starting a new venture, or if you already have a brand and you want to take it to that next level, then get in touch and WLC will be able to help. For transparency purposes, let me also tell you that WLC is actually a company that I founded and am the director of. When you get in touch with WLC, you'll be getting in touch with me and my team, and we look forward to greeting you and seeing how we can help. Thank you, and now let's get back to the episode. Rick, President Biden said at the start of the war that Israel is vital to the interest of US, and if Israel didn't exist, the US would have to create an Israel. How can that be justified? As in, what benefit has Israel been to the US in the Middle East?
Mm-hmm. Well, so people who argue that say that it's a launching pad there for to maintain control over the Arab states and to prevent them from allying with in the Soviet Union in the past, or for alternate countries. But I increasingly question that. Question the idea that Israel is in the United States' interest, because it seems to be quite the opposite.
Yeah.
In fact, and what we were just talking about, how the atrocities being committed by Israel today are exposing the amorality and the hypocrisy of the West more than anything else. So yeah. I think even it's always it's been questionable for a long time, but it's definitely the case now that Israel's actions are hurting, not helping the United States.
Right, because even when you look at the war that was waged in Iraq, Israel was asked clearly to stay out of that, because the involvement of Israel would have been to the detriment of the US. So, and I think that is the case generally, whether it's wartime or peacetime. I think US is losing out, friends, because if Israel not gaining more influence in the region.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's one element, or there's one aspect where Israel is beneficial to the military-industrial complex. Number one, they have a guaranteed supply of approximately $4 billion in U.S. weaponry every year. That's very good for the military-industrial complex. Number two, the fact that it's this aggressive force threatening its neighbors makes its neighbors, such as Egypt and Jordan and other countries, order weapons. Of course, Egypt is the second biggest recipient of U.S. military aid. And so the military-industrial complex does like Israel, and the consequences of that in preventing it from preventing things from stabilizing and ensuring a steady supply, steady contracts every single year of military weaponry.
Right. Yeah. That's a really good point. That makes sense actually, because I was trying to understand what is the US getting out of this relationship. Rick, also, I read a recent article that you wrote where you argued that had Kennedy not been assassinated, things could have been a lot different in the Middle East and with Israel. Would you like to talk about that a little bit? Because when I started reading that article, I was a little bit skeptical. I was thinking maybe this is just kind of like, because of Kennedy's not around, is kind of sympathetic to Kennedy. But as I read it, it was difficult to disagree with your arguments. Would you like to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. I think that was a critical point, a critical change in U.S. foreign policy when Kennedy was assassinated, and there were four different elements of Kennedy's policy, which really they stand in total opposition to the policies that the U.S. has followed ever since his assassination. One of them is that Kennedy wanted to be friends with Gamal Abdel Nasser. He supported Algerian independence. So Kennedy was not biased in favor of Israel the way all subsequent U.S. presidents have been. Another one is that the Kennedy administration supported Palestinian refugees. They supported UN Resolution 194, the right of return, much to the animosity of the Israelis. Another example, another real distinguishing factor of the Kennedy administration was they were insisting that the Zionists and the predecessor to AIPAC register as agents of a foreign country. And the Department of Justice under Bobby Kennedy was demanding that the Zionists of America, which gave birth to AIPAC, that they had to register as agents of a foreign country. And finally, Kennedy was adamant in trying to stop Israel from acquiring a nuclear bomb, which of course they didn't. They were in the process of developing and lying through their teeth that they were only developing nuclear power for peaceful purposes, when of course the real intent was to develop nuclear weapons. So Kennedy was pushing on all those four fronts, and it came to a head in 1963. And there's a new book out called JFK and RFK's Secret Battle Against Israeli Extremism, that includes my article, and it includes all of the documents that I referred to. For example, the letters between Ben-Gurion and Levi Eshkol and JFK, which are really striking to read those articles. And much of this information has just been released in recent years, actually. So that's I titled the article From Dallas to Gaza, because I think the horrors that we're witnessing in Gaza could have been avoided. The whole Israeli atrocities against Palestinians could have been prevented if Kennedy had lived, and if a different form of Israel had not gone the route that they did, which was to be an ethno-supremacist state, attacking Palestinians and preventing Palestinians from having any meaningful life, the occupation and so forth. So I think things could have turned out very differently, but of course he was assassinated, and it turns out that Lyndon Johnson was very much beholden to Zionists, and was very much under their thumb, to the extent that in 1967, during the Six-Day War, Israel attacked the USS Liberty, killed 34 U.S. sailors, injured another 194, and all of Canada, and Lyndon Johnson prevented ships from coming to the rescue and prevented the sailors from talking about the event afterward.
That's really interesting. All four of the points that you mentioned in the article were very strong, and I hadn't thought about that before, but especially point number 4 about Israel, how Kennedy opposed Israel getting nuclear weapons, and the letters that you talked about, how Kennedy was trying to arrange inspections of nuclear sites in Israel, and Israel was kind of resisting that until the end, and how Lyndon Johnson came and things completely changed. That was amazing. Something I hadn't read about or heard about before, but also how until that point, I mean, America was known to be sympathetic to freedom movements all over the world because of its own history, its own freedom movement, and how America has changed is unbelievable. Do you think that was the turning point after Kennedy?
I do. I really believe that was a turning point. There's a very good book called JFK and the Unspeakable. It's about 10 or 12 years old now, but it's relatively recent book. And in that book, the author James Douglas talks about Kennedy's policies around the world, not just in the Middle East. In fact, that is the one shortcoming in the book, because he does not give adequate attention to the situation with Israel. That's the significant shortcoming of the book. But otherwise, it's brilliant in talking about how Kennedy was evolved, and of course, it's epitomized by his speech at American University in June of 1963, where he talked about a peaceful world, about accepting and having peaceful competition with the Soviet Union, but avoiding conflict, and in all sorts of ways. Of course, the U.S. policy after Kennedy assassination, that's when the coups took place all over Latin America, in Indonesia, in Africa. The assassination of Patrice Lumumba, the overthrow of Sihanouk in Indonesia, the coups in Brazil and throughout Latin America, that all followed on Kennedy's assassination, and that was the U.S. foreign policy of dominance and aggression and control and hegemony run wild. And Kennedy was opposed to that in significant ways. And there's Kennedy delivered a speech in support of Algerian independence. I think it's like a 7,000 or 8,000 word speech. And when Ben Bella became president, he welcomed him to the White House with a red carpet on the lawn of the White House. It was a huge ceremony that was very symbolic of Kennedy wanting to support the liberation movements and the independence of the third world. Of course, it was, I mean, I'm not too rosy-eyed. I realized that the United States wanted to influence and to be the dominant power, but they wanted peaceful competition with the communist world, not war. And of course, Kennedy had been in war. His own brother was killed in World War II. He himself fought and was injured. He had an understanding of war that subsequent presidents don't have.
That's really interesting. I'm going to put the link to your article in the notes, and I encourage everyone listening to to have a look at that. It's really fascinating. Rick, also, I've been listening to your previous interviews and with great interest because I see you have a lot of interest and sympathy for Syria, which is a country I really love, and I'm very sorry to see what's happened there. I've
Mhm.
traveled to Syria in the past, and I was really impressed how well everything was working, and then how everything's been turned upside down by the so-called color revolution. Would you like to talk a little bit about that? I remember you saying that the main question when we look back at Syria is whether what's happened is a civil war or if it's a war waged by outside forces, and it's the
Mhm.
latter that you think is the case. And I completely agree with you there.
Mhm. Yeah, I definitely think Syria was targeted for a color revolution. Of course, it began in 2011, and it was in the wake of events in Libya. And in fact, after the overthrow of Muammar Gaddafi and the seizure of the weapons of the Libyan military, they were shipped to clandestinely and under the guise under the control of the CIA to Syria. And so I think I think it was being concocted. I think the insurrection was in development for several years. They used radicalized Islamists, just as was done in Afghanistan back beginning in 1979 and then through the 80s. They used politicized, uh, weaponized people who were manipulated really into in, into hatred and to opposition, and that was the spearhead of the conflict in Iran. They even manipulated Chinese Uyghurs
Yeah.
who are of Muslim faith, and thousands of those people were mobilized and then traveled from Western China, from Xinjiang province, through Turkey, and they are now part of the jihad controlling Idlib province in northern Syria. So it was, I think, there's a lot of evidence that it was a Western supported campaign, and they managed to destroy so much of the country. And the war continues because the U.S. sanctions prevent Syria from being able to recover and to rebuild. Um, and uh, and the country is still so greatly weakened by the economic pressure. Things are turning around slowly. More and more countries are recognizing this Damascus government, but the damage has been so huge, and
Yeah.
it'll go down as another one of these crimes. But early on in the Bush administration, back in 2000, the early 2000s, when they were preparing to invade Iraq, um, there was a list of 7 countries that were
Yeah.
going to be targets of regime change, and if you look at each and every one of those has suffered tremendously and has been subject to tremendous amount of conflict and war. Um, precisely because the U.S. targeted them, provided a lot of money to foment dissent, provided a lot of political manipulation, and the result is tragic.
Yes. And I think it was so sad to see how in the West there was almost like on the streets there was almost no resistance to this whole what's happened in Syria, and they just kind of people lapped it up thinking this is color revolution, and they completely fell for it.
Hmm.
Whereas when we had the war in Iraq, there was huge kind of rallies and protests everywhere. But what they did in Syria is like people kind of fell for that and thought this is like a, a indigenous kind of a grassroots movement, which it wasn't at all.
Right. No, you're exactly right. And many people who support the Palestinian cause fell for it as well.
Yeah. When was the last time you were there?
I was there in 2021
Wow.
for the election, actually.
Okay.
And it was very inspiring to see the people turning out en masse, to see the vote taking place, to see the enthusiasm for President Assad. Um, so the lies just continue. The amount of distortion and lies, and how to explain it. Partly as much as partly through money, but uh, the West is very good at political manipulation, and they're very good at disguising what they're doing. For example, you had the development of the so-called white helmets there, which was a very effective propaganda tool, and it convinced a lot of people that, oh, here are these everyday Syrians who were rescuing people from the trenches. And of course, what it was a political editorial group that was stoking the hatred of the Assad government, and that was constantly feeding propaganda, and in the United States was promoting the U.S. Senate to take more and more aggressive stances against Syria. So the West is good at propaganda, and one has to be extremely wary of and look into the details of the situation.
Rick, at the start of this interview, you mentioned you've just got back from China. How
Mhm.
long were you there? What was the nature of your journey, and what did you learn from inside China? How do they see everything that's unfolding?
Well, I was there from October 16 through October 30. It was mostly a tourist trip. We were but we did some other activities looking at the situation. We started in Shanghai and spent a few days there, and then we flew west to Urumqi, which is the capital of Xinjiang province. And I was especially curious to visit Xinjiang, which is 1/6 of the total area of China, because that is where the Uyghurs are from.
Yes.
And from my interest in Syria, I was interested to see the homeland of the people who some thousands of whom went to Syria and became part of the Al Qaeda, essentially, Jabhat al Nusra or Hayat Tahrir al Sham. It goes by different names, but it's basically the Syrian version of Al Qaeda. So I was interested to see what it's like, and I was very impressed. There's very large cities; they're thriving. The population is doing very well. They have very low unemployment rate. The claims that China is suppressing the Uyghur language and culture. There's a lot of evidence those are not true. I visited a school where they were teaching Uyghur language, which is a script. It's got the Arab script. In the classroom, all these students were learning to write in Uyghur.
Wow.
And the culture is thriving, and it's promoted. The culture being the type of dress, the dance, the music. So I think the accusations that have been made are inaccurate, and not that everybody's happy, but I think a lot of the vast majority of the population are happy, and it's Xinjiang seems to be thriving. We covered a lot of ground. We weren't restricted in any way from walking around and visiting sites and places. We talked with numerous people, and so I think the wish for the West that China would divide up and break up along ethnic lines, as the West has always has also hoped Russia would do the same. Those are not being realized, and on the contrary, China is becoming more and more unified.
That's so interesting. I would love to go to Xinjiang and visit some of these places that you've been to. Um, it's kind of, yeah, I've always thought about it and it's motivated me now even more. While you were in China, did you get to speak to any academics or journalists about what's happening in Russia or the Middle East? Um, and what were their views? To,
Uh, on this trip, we did not do that. And but the BRICS conference took place in Kazan while we were there. So I
oh,
was,
you were there.
I was very interested to see the coverage on Chinese media, and it was very, very positive. It seems that BRICS is really emerging as a very strong a counterbalance to the domination of the G7 and the West. And now there are 13 different partner countries that are being added to the list. It's great to see Cuba among those. So I think China is very confident that the world is moving in a multipolar direction and away from the U.S. hegemony,
Yeah.
and they don't seem to want to, push that to the point of a confrontation. But the trend is very clear that the world is moving away from the U.S. domination, and more and more countries want to realize that they've got much stronger allies in Russia, China, and the other countries in the BRICS than they do relying on the West.
Yes. Going back to where we started with Russia and Trump maybe wanting to stop that war, apart from anything else, because it's for Ukraine, it's a losing war, and Trump doesn't really like to be on the losing side of things.
Mm-hmm.
So I was even speaking to Tim Anderson before. I'm not sure if you are aware of him, but he's an expert on Syrian affairs as well. And one of the things that he mentioned quite interested me was that, like, it's possible that Trump might want to just do a deal with Russia that might include putting an end to what's happening in the Middle East as well, just so that he can concentrate more kind of clearly on competing with China, whether that's going to be like a economic rivalry or a military rivalry. But do you think what's happening in Russia and Middle East is a distraction from that main kind of purpose?
Mm-hmm. I think that's a very interesting analysis. Of course, I do know Tim, and his book, The Dirty War on Syria, is terrific. I highly recommend it. And Tim is a tremendous analyst and very courageous supporter of the Palestinian cause. But I think that's a real possibility. Trump has explicitly said that we need to divide Russia and China. And he just comes out right out and says it, which of course is true. That's going back to Zbigniew Brzezinski. That was one of the things he said, is that the disaster scenario is Russia, China, and Iran uniting, and that's exactly what they've done within BRICS and beyond. So I think that is a possibility. That would be a good thing, of course, if the U.S. was to just say, okay, the Ukraine effort failed, it didn't work out, and move forward. That would be a good thing. I think the goal of dividing Russia from China is not going to be easily achieved by the West, because Russia and China both know that the U.S. word is not worth much.
Yeah.
So they're smart, but hopefully the tragedy in Iran can be put to an end, sooner than as soon as possible.
Yeah, I'm thinking because the West has, with their policies, with their stoking up these conflicts, have brought these three great nations, civilizations closer together. And as you say, America's always realized, USA has always realized that for them it's vital to keep these three countries apart. So somehow all of that kind of understanding of international relations has gone out the window, and it seems like the neocons are just interested in war without understanding the consequences of what they're doing. But I'm thinking, I'm surprised that by now China, Russia, and Iran haven't realized that the West is going to keep at it until basically these countries are destroyed or are clearly able to resist. So why don't they do a military pact with each other? I know there's some talks going on about a pact between Iran and Russia. Do you know the nature of that? And I'm surprised that these three countries, if they do a pact a bit like NATO, surely that would be the end of everything, no?
Well, Russia and China say they've got a stronger partnership than a military pact. So I'm not sure, but the fact that Russia is supporting Iran, that's sending a very strong message. And I think China may have reservations about a direct military pact with Russia, but they're cautious in that they don't want to provoke an unnecessarily negative reaction from the West. It's like they're not trying to take down SWIFT, the Western the bank interchange mechanism. They're not trying to directly challenge that all at once. There's just incrementally. And so I think something about the Chinese approach to diplomacy is there. The trend is very much against the United States. It's and they think that I think that they are going to prevail, just slow and steady.
Yeah, yeah. I think time is on their side,
Yes.
whereas for the West, time is not on their side at the moment.
Yeah, exactly.
Rick, thank you so much for your time and your analysis and your insights. If people want to get in touch with you or see your work, what's the best way for them to do that?
Oh, well, they can just search on my name, Rick Sterling, and antiwar.com or LA Progressive or Dissident Voice, some of the other publications, or by subject matter, Syria, or I've written also around Nicaragua, different topics. And my email is usually included in the byline of articles, and so I would welcome if anybody wants to reach out to me personally, that would be welcome as well.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. I will make sure to leave some links in the notes as well. And
Okay.
I'd be grateful if you could spare some time another day, and I'd love to learn a little bit more about Latin America, because that's an area that I'm interested in, but don't know too much about, and I think it's very important.
Yeah. Okay, very good, Tafim. Very nice to be here.
Thank you, Rick. Take care. Bye.
Yeah, bye-bye.